Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 5 Hearthstone cards that are inevitably going to be nerfed. As you look back through the history of Hearthstone and the way that Blizzard changes or nerfs cards, you can start to see some real trends and tendencies and patterns in how they go about that. In particular, there's a real emphasis on basic set cards and classic set cards that tend to be really powerful or run across a variety of archetypes or a variety of decks. We see those get nerfed harder than newer cards. So if they're going to adjust a deck that's particularly prominent right now, even if there are new cards that affect that deck, they might still nerf classic cards instead, because those are cards that either limit design space or just, they're getting tired of seeing in constructed format. And it seems like in general, Blizzard wants to reduce the amount of classic and basic cards that are run in any given popular top tier meta deck moving forward. I think they want more diversity, a little more freshness in Hearthstone's meta, so that new expansions make up a larger percentage of any given deck list as compared to basic or classic set cards. Now, some people out there might say that there are some ulterior motives in that nerfing free cards that are part of the basic set in particular makes it more difficult for new players to enter the game, therefore requiring people to buy more card packs and more directly affecting Blizzard's bottom line. I'm not here to get into that particular conspiracy theory, if you will. It certainly has some merits, I think, but I like to put some good faith in Blizzard and some trust in Blizzard, and that they think that this is ultimately going to be the best thing for the game. But regardless, if you follow those trends and you look at some of the cards today that are part of the classic set or part of the basic set, it seems to me like there are 5 cards in particular that stand out that likely will either be nerfed in the next year or so, or at the very least, a lot of them might be rotated into the Hall of Fame, which we've seen as a sort of pseudo-nerf to cards like Ragnaros and Sylvanas in the past, and a handful of other class cards as well, which I think some of the class cards in this list in particular might follow suit and go down that road as well. But all that said, I think these cards, don't get too attached to them. I have a feeling, based on the data of how often these are played and the kinds of decks that run them, guess what? These cards are getting nerfed, so let's go ahead and jump into that list. Up first is Mage's Ice Block. Ice Block has been one of the dominant strategies for Mage throughout the history of Hearthstone. Freeze Mage in particular is a deck that in some iteration or another has been around basically always. Right now, it's not necessarily a traditional Freeze Mage so much as a Quest Mage that we see being played on the ladder, but everybody knows just how frustrating Ice Block is to play against. I myself have called for this card to be nerfed because I think it just creates some pretty fun and uninteractive states in Hearthstone. Now, of course, there are those out there who love playing Ice Block. Yeah, I get it. It's fun to play against. It's fun to be immortal for a few turns. So I liked that this card had a place in Hearthstone. I think it was original and fun and unique to the game. But I do think its time is due. And although I don't think every card on this list necessarily deserves to be nerfed, Ice Block is in fact one that I think does. Not to mention that Blizzard hates when the same kinds of strategies and the same kinds of decks just continue to show up over and over again. I think they've even specifically addressed Ice Block as one of the cards that they're keeping their eye on. So between the fact that just mages have always run this, it's a part of the classic set, and it's a card that Blizzard has already mentioned specifically, it looks to me like Ice Block is inevitably going to either be nerfed or maybe more likely moved to the Hall of Fame, so some of those strategies are at least restricted to a single format, and standard format and Mage can start to move away from the strategies that Ice Block provides. Moving on to the second card on my list, it's Doomsayer. And this one is on this list merely because it is so darn popular. If you look at the stats for Doomsayer, this is one of the most played cards in the game, and certainly one of the most played classic set cards in the game. And as I mentioned, Blizzard doesn't love it when classic or basic cards dominate a meta, and Doomsayer has been dominating for a very long time. Basically, any control deck finds some way to run Doomsayer, and it's just a really powerful play that can shut out your opponent's tempo, force them to lose their minions on board, but also lose an entire turn of developing additional resources, which is a great, powerful control tool. I love using Doomsayer myself because I tend to like to play control decks a little bit more than aggro decks, but I still can recognize and objectively say that if everybody's running this card successfully, even outside of combos like Frost Nova plus Doomsayer, but you're just running it as a tempo control tool, then maybe it's getting a little bit too much use, and perhaps it is a card that would be suitable for a nerf. So how would Blizzard change this? I think there's a couple things you could do. You could just increase its cost to 3 mana so that it still works as a sort of tempo setup. Like if you clear the board and play a Doomsayer, you still get initiative passed back your way, but it's a little bit harder to combo out with certain cards. I think you could also just reduce its health to something like 6, so that occasionally your opponent is more easily able to kill it. Both of those would reduce the viability of this card. I think reducing its health might be a little more elegant because it would still make it better in combo situations, like when you combine it with Frost Nova, for instance, in particular. Without keeping it quite as viable as just a general turn 2 or turn 3 tempo style card. So I think that would be a good change, and a change I expect we'll eventually see. This one might take a while, but I expect in the next round or two of nerfs that Blizzard introduces, maybe after the next expansion, maybe the next wild format rotation, I think we'll see Doomsayer be affected in some way or another. And then up next at the number 3 spot is Rogue's Preparation. This is a card that Blizzard has outright come out and said, we're keeping an eye on Preparation. We think it's the card that restricts our design space more than any other card in Hearthstone right now. And when you hear proclamations like that, it's a very, very good sign. This card is either going to be nerfed, or I think maybe more likely it's going to be moved to the Hall of Fame, which, is a nerf in and of itself in many ways for standard format in particular. So Preparation, of course, just gives rogues the ability to pull off ridiculous things when combined with spells. I mean, most historically, this has been used to empower cards like Gadget Zan Auctioneer and even Edwin Van Cleef a little bit, when you can do things like, cast a free Mimic Pod, and that's 2 spells to empower your Edwin Van Cleef. You've got all those counterfeit coins and everything else. You can pull off ridiculous sorts of combos. And then with Gadget Zan Auctioneer, this makes it so much easier to draw additional cards and sort of create a path where Preparation draws you a card into a card that you now can play at a discounted cost and just continue to chain with your Gadget Zan Auctioneer. And both of those cards have been incredibly popular in Rogue for a very, very long time. Rogue has stuck to the Miracle archetype almost exclusively until very recently, with decks like the Prince Keleseth Shadow Step Rogue that's currently gaining a ton of popularity. But when a card like this is just so predominant in the class, and so much about the class's success is built upon the foundation of Preparation, that it's the kind of card that makes its cut in almost every single list, that is a problem card, not to mention this powerful of a mana reduction effect. Seems like something Blizzard is scared to work with. They continue to remove cards like Innervate and other, mana acceleration kinds of cards, and that's exactly what Preparation does, just in a little bit of a different manner. But all of those signs point to this card either being nerfed, maybe it just reduces the cost of spells down to 2, or maybe it moves to Hall of Fame. I don't know what the answer will be, but you can certainly bet that Blizzard is going to do something about Preparation. And then we'll move on to my number 4 card. This one might surprise some people. I don't think this is one that a lot of people have called to be nerfed, or a lot of people are thinking about getting nerfed. But I think Spellbreaker is going to be on Blizzard's radar very, very soon. And by the way, yes, the artwork behind me is the highest resolution artwork I could find. It looks like garbage, but Blizzard doesn't always release all of the high-res assets, so forgive me for that. But why is Spellbreaker so due for a nerf? If you look, it has become essentially the number 1 tech card in Hearthstone right now. Pretty much everybody's playing Spellbreaker, whether you're an aggro deck or a control deck. There are so many taunts and so many high-value kinds of cards that Spellbreaker works really well against, that you almost have to run it. So many lists, whether it's Pirate Warrior or just big late-game control decks like Jade Druid, they're all fitting in Spellbreaker. And when a single card like that is run so widespread across the entire meta, that becomes a target card for Blizzard. Much like Doomsayer previously, this is another classic set card. And frankly, we've already seen a Silence card that did the same thing in Ironbeak Owl. That was a card that already got nerfed for the very same reason. It was such a predominant Silence card, and Blizzard doesn't always like Silence in the first place because I think they realize that it reduces a little bit of the fun when you do your big awesome thing and your Spike Ridge Steed on your Tyrian Forge Ring or whatever it is, and it gets silenced. That kind of sucks sometimes. It's important to have tech card answers, of course, but Blizzard doesn't like it when fun is removed from the game. and I think Spellbreaker in many ways can cause that as a problem. So what would happen to this card? It could be bumped up to 5 mana just given the Ironbeak Owl treatment. I think more realistically they might just decrease the stats of it a little bit so it's less of an influence on the board after you actually silence a minion. So maybe it goes down to a 3/3 or maybe even more aptly a 4/2, so it's very easy to remove and becomes a much less significant addition to the board. In aggressive decks in particular, it's something that just gets killed really easily by incidental AoE damage instead of becoming an actual threatening 4 damage minion. There are a handful of different ways to nerf this guy, but I expect, given just how commonly we see this card right now in Hearthstone, this is absolutely something Blizzard has their eye on, and I don't expect Spellbreaker to survive the year without seeing some sort of nerf or adjustment. And then finally for my 5th card, it's actually another mage class spell, which might surprise some people, but I don't think it should, because Mage as a class uses so many different basic and classic cards in so many of their decks, and it really doesn't stop at Ice Block and Fireball. If you look through the basic card list for Mage, there are a ton of great spells. The classic set, a ton of great spells. You can just move through and it's like, wow, half of these are played across almost every Mage deck. Now, I personally like that. I love that there's a class that's really easy for new players to jump into, utilize very powerful basic set cards that come totally free. As long as they play the game, they're going to be able to assemble some cool pieces into a deck and start winning games. I think that's awesome. But unfortunately, as we've seen with the nerf to things like Hex and Fire War Axe recently, apparently Blizzard doesn't necessarily love that, and they take some of the strongest basic set cards and they nerf them. And Fireball, to me, is the strongest of the basic set cards to Mage, a class which already has a ton of basic cards that they utilize. So I think this will be the card that is the target of Blizzard's nerfs. 6 damage for 4 mana, it's sort of the staple go-to damage spell in Hearthstone. And as strong and as powerful as it is, I think it's going to be removed either from standard format altogether with a Hall of Fame treatment, or more likely, I expect it'll just be nerfed. I think that changes a couple things. It makes Quest Mage a less oppressive deck, which a lot of people would like, but also just reduces the total damage output that's available to Mage, which can sometimes be frustrating. So I think a couple things could happen. I think this might move to 5 mana, so it's a 6 damage for 5 mana spell. I also think they might just reduce the damage to 5 instead of 6. Both of those would go a long way towards making this card just a little bit weaker, but still keeping it probably a little bit relevant and still playable in a lot of decks. So I would be sad to see this one changed, but I think Blizzard recognizes the raw power of this card as a free card, and that's a combination, once again, that unfortunately they don't seem to like. So Fireball, probably gonna get nerfed. And there you go, guys. Those are the 5 cards that I think are inevitably going to be nerfed by Blizzard. Those are the 5 cards that show the tendencies that match up, that line up with cards we've seen in the past, very powerful classic or basic set cards that are run in a ton of different decks that are synonymous with their class. Those are the cards that Blizzard likes to adjust downward to make them weaker. Now, again, I don't necessarily think all these cards should be nerfed. Not saying that. Don't attack me. I'm just identifying the pattern of nerfs that Blizzard has introduced in the past and extrapolating that pattern onto cards that haven't been adjusted yet and saying, look guys, I think these cards are at risk. Now, what does this mean for you? Certainly some of your favorite decks could get nerfed, and you might lose the ability to play those successfully in the ladder, but at the very least you'll get your Arcane Dust refunded, except in the case of basic cards where you'll get nothing back, which is unfortunate once again. I don't like that Blizzard's sort of inadvertently or maybe even intentionally attacking the new player base by nerfing all these basic cards, but that's a discussion for another day. As it stands right now, what cards do you guys think are going to be nerfed? Are the 5 cards on this list the right cards? Are there other cards out there that it looks like Blizzard will have to adjust before too long? I want to hear your take on both these cards, but also other suggestions you expect to see nerfed along the way. All that said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.